Welcome all to the Department of Energy's SBIR STTR Programs Office webinar. My name is Chris Ogwin, and I am with the DOE SBIR Programs Office, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Today's presenter is the DOE SBIR STTR Programs Director, Dr. Manny Oliver. Manny will provide you with an overview of the federal SBIR STTR programs, the DOE SBIR STTR technology areas, and the DOE application and award process as it relates to this fiscal year 2014 Phase 1 Release 2 funding opportunity announcement. We will be taking texted questions, so feel free to send in your chat questions there at the lower left-hand side of your screen throughout the webinar, and at the conclusion of this, Manny will address these as time permits, and many of the questions that were submitted as part of registration have been worked into this webinar. So hopefully we'll be able to answer most, if not, most of your questions. I'd like to remind folks as you're sending in your text questions, please keep them focused on the funding opportunity announcement and not necessarily on the technology area or your innovation as it relates to the topics. Those questions should be directed to the topic managers as listed in the topics document in which you can find on our website. You'll see that website throughout the presentation at the bottom of the slide, many of the slides, and it will also be at the conclusion of our website listed there too. Or you can just Google DOE SBIR and you'll find our website fairly quickly. And I think that covers some of the intro stuff. Why don't we go ahead and kick off? I believe we got Manny on the line here. Manny?
Okay, thanks, Chris. And as Chris mentioned, the presentation is kind of in three parts. Some of you have attended our webinars in the past, so it'll follow roughly the same format. We'll talk briefly about the federal programs, the programs as a whole, primarily for first-time applicants who may not be aware of other programs outside the DOE SBIR. And then we'll talk about the DOE SBIR and STTR programs. And then finally, those of you, especially new, interested in how do I apply and the information you need associated with that. So let's start with the federal programs. In terms of the purpose of SBIR and STTR, the programs were created in the 80s and 90s. Again, they're two separate programs. I'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two in the next slide. But the motivation was to set aside federal R&D funding for small businesses, because small businesses often were at a disadvantage to compete for R&D funds compared to universities and large companies. And so, again, in the early 80s, the SBIR program was set up. And again, those were the goals when it was originally set up, shown at the top of the screen. And again, one of the things we want to point out, we do encourage participation by minority-owned and women-owned small businesses. There are no specific set-asides for any groups. It's a merit-based competition, but we do encourage participation by those groups. And the last goal there, in terms of the focus on private sector commercialization of federal R&D, that's actually gotten an increased emphasis, especially in the last few years. The area of technology transfer of innovations where the Department of Energy is funding work at universities and national labs. We would like to see those move out, at least those that have resulted in patents or other intellectual property to move out for private sector commercialization. Again, over time, the programs have evolved since their original charter, and we just want to emphasize that the emphasis on the commercialization has increased. Again, the programs are R&D programs, so we really only fund early-stage R&D, so I want to point that out, but we do want applicants, in terms of submitting their proposals, to let us know what the commercial potential of their inventions are. With regard to where this sits kind of in the whole funding chain, the type of funding, the amounts we have, and the type of work we fund really sort of competes with angel investing in the private sector. It's the early stage seed capital. Some venture firms also do seed stage funding. But the biggest difference between government funding in this area and I think private sector is that we have specific agency missions. and we are willing to take greater risk to succeed in those missions. And those missions, again, will vary by agency. In terms of the nature of the federal program, the oversight for the program is by the Small Business Administration. And although the Small Business Administration provides oversight in terms of policy directives and annual reports, it does not actually is not the organization that you would apply to seek funding. There are 11 federal agencies that run the SBIR and STTR programs, and here I'll mention the SBIR, again, was the earlier program, and there are 11 agencies that are listed there. For those of you new to the government, I apologize for the acronyms. I do have the acronyms listed on the next page in case you're wondering what all these agencies are. And the way the programs are funded, I want to point out, is that they do not receive appropriations from Congress. Congress doesn't give each agency a set of money to implement this. Instead, what happens is they take a percentage of each agency's extramural R&D budget. Extramural refers to R&D money that the agency sends outside the agency for research, as opposed to the intramural research, which is R&D performed at the agency. And again, for 2014, that's 2.8% of our extramural budgets. The STTR program, again, which is different, has more focus on tech transfer, and therefore requires collaboration with a nonprofit research institution like a university or a national lab. Again, this program is smaller. It's only 0.4% of agency extramural budgets this year, and there are only 5 agencies that participate in the STTR program. DOE, being a larger R&D program office, does participate in both programs. So when you look at the combined funding across the federal government, there's quite a bit of money going out through the SBIR and STTR program, so $2.4 billion in total. And you can see that it's not spread very equally. Certainly the largest source of R&D in the government is the Department of Defense, and then the second is the National Institutes of Health. DOE is kind of in that next tier with NASA and the National Science Foundation. And again, there are another 6 agencies that participate, and we would encourage you to look at those if the focus area of these agencies overlap with the technology areas that you're interested in. So, for example, folks who work with the Department of Energy who might work on bioenergy might be interested in looking at the Department of Agriculture. Some of the work, if you're working on environmental issues, we did receive a question asking about how much work DOE does in the area of pollution abatement, and that is not a focus area. So we do treat greenhouse gases as a harmful to the environment, and so there is research in that area in terms of carbon capture and sequestration, and all the work in renewable energy and energy efficiency, trying to reduce CO2 emissions. But so again, we would encourage you to look at some of the other agencies in addition to DOE if you're new to the SBIR programs. In terms of eligibility and the way we implement the programs, these are small business programs. You do have to be a for-profit business. I guess we did receive a question in advance about being a nonprofit. So we will only accept applications for a for-profit small business. I've summarized the eligibility requirements here. They get a little more detailed. We get a lot of questions about ownership structure and that. So that we would actually refer you to the funding opportunity announcement. If you're still, after reading that, still have questions, please contact us and we'll help you work through that. Some ownership of some companies does get fairly involved. So I did want to point out, and again, you do have to be small, and small is defined as 500 or fewer employees. In terms of your principal investigator for your application, for SBIR, that person does have to be primarily employed by the small business. And for STTR, one of the other key differences with STTR, in addition to collaborating with a research institution, is it does allow the PI to come from the research institution as opposed to the small business. One of the other things I want to point out is one of the recent changes in the legislation is it allows agencies to opt in to allowing companies that are majority owned by venture capital, hedge fund, or private equity firms to participate. At this time, the Department of Energy has not opted into that. So if you're majority owned by venture capital, you are not eligible to participate and apply at this time. I would point out that the National Institutes of Health and ARPA-E do have opted into that, and I'll talk a little more about ARPA-E later. In terms of how the agencies implement these programs, they are a phased program, and that money is given out in phases. So a phase one is where you would start. It's typically a feasibility study. Depending on the agency, the length of the phase one would be 6 to 12 months. It's 9 months here at DOE. And the award amount is typically $150,000. For phase two, after you complete phase one, all the phase one awardees would compete for phase two funding. So you can only apply for phase two if you received a phase one. And that's a longer duration, more funding, $1 million typical, and that's kind of a prototype development phase. And then there's phase three. I would point out that the allocations that I had indicated before in terms of setting aside funding, they are only to be used for phase one and phase two. Phase three refers to the commercialization phase that's often funded by the private sector, for example, for DOE, where the Department of Energy is not generally looking to buy your technology. And also, in some cases, some federal agencies, for example, the Department of Defense, would be the primary source of phase three funding because they would be looking to acquire the technology. Let me move on. And so, one of the things that makes some of the features that make the SBIR and STTR programs very attractive to small businesses is that there is no cost sharing required for phase one and phase two awards. And again, depending on the agency, typically there may be, say, a 20% cost share, typically for R&D projects. The other thing is that if you develop patents as a result of your R&D award, that you do have the right to file for rights to those inventions. The government does retain what's called government use rights. So if there was some reason the government ever needed to use your invention, it would not have to pay you royalties for that. And that's not, the government is not going to get into the business of competing with you. It's just retaining these rights since it funded the research. If you choose to go after big commercial opportunities and not address some of the needs that the government has, it has the right to have the invention used for have a product made, for example, for its own use. And then finally, for those of you who might be worried about sending in your proprietary ideas into the government and having that protected, so your data rights associated with the award, we protect that data for a minimum of 4 years after the conclusion of your award. And that award period is extended, for example, if you continue to do R&D. So if after the end of your phase two, for example, we would wait 4 years. And if you're continuing to do the R&D or to move to phase three, that 4 years starts when you finish your R&D on that particular project. Okay, now that's kind of the general overview on the federal programs, and now I'll focus a little more on what the Department of Energy does with its SBIR and STTR programs. This is the mission statement for the Department of Energy, and the important thing I wanted to point out here is that there are really 3 different technology areas that we work in. One that we are sort of best known for is this emphasis on clean energy. And clean energy can mean things like energy efficiency and renewable energy, but also means other energy sources, for example, fossil energy, where the focus is on how do we utilize that energy as cleanly and efficiently as possible, as well as nuclear energy. Another large area of R&D funding with the Department of Energy, though, is our work out of the Office of Science, which funds a lot of basic R&D. And that actually represents almost 2/3 of the R&D funding, the extramural R&D funding within the Department of Energy. And finally, the work in nuclear security. Because the Department of Energy actually makes the nuclear weapons for the Department of Defense, we have a very large effort in that area. The SBR programs, however, are really just focused on issues related to nonproliferation and environmental cleanup. On the next chart, I'm going to actually show the org chart, and I apologize, this is probably barely readable. And this used to be a little more, we just recently reorganized, which made this a little more challenging. So most of the, you'll see here, the secretary, there are 3 large offices headed by undersecretaries, and most of the R&D in the department now goes on this in the Undersecretary of Science and Energy. So this includes the Office of Science, and there are actually 6 research programs here within the Office of Science. And actually our office, the DOE, SBR, and STTR Programs Office, also resides in the Office of Science. Under the NNSA, we have Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation, and under our Management and Performance Undersecretary, we have the Office of Environmental Management. All these, in the dotted line there, all these programs participate in what's referred to as the DOE, SBR, STTR programs. Up in the upper right, there are the ARPA-E, SBR, and STTR programs. So this is a separate set of SBR and STTR programs. And they're administered separately, and their topics generally follow the ARPA-E R&D areas. In terms of total budget, most of the R&D funding in the department goes through the larger DOE, approximately $175 million a year. ARPA-E is on the order of $7 to $8 million a year. Now, in terms of how we operate the programs, again, the DOE, SBR, and STTR Programs Office is the primary sort of administrative office and the one you'll deal with largely for submitting applications. So we develop the funding opportunity announcements, administer the review and selection process, and then ensure compliance with legislation and policy directives for these programs. We work closely with, as I mentioned on the previous chart, all the different R&D programs throughout the department. Their role, again, since they really have the technical expertise, are to develop the topics. When you submit your proposal, they will identify appropriate reviewers, make award recommendations, and finally, those are also the folks that would manage your project once it's underway. If you do receive an award, on the upper right is shown our DOE Chicago office. So once you are selected, you would work with them to actually finalize the negotiation of your grant. They would actually issue the award and do the grant closeout at the end of your award. I think I'll emphasize this again in the talk, but DOE, we did have some questions about the difference between DOE and some of the other programs. So we do issue SBR and STT awards as grants, not contracts. And so that's a fairly important difference in terms of receiving your funding, especially trying to get it in a timely fashion. So I also wanted to point out, for the different technical program offices that DOE, many of them maintain their own websites, and I'll have links to them on the next few slides. Although many of you often in case are focused on your innovation and technology idea, what we'd like to encourage you to do is also go to these program websites and learn more about what's being funded in these areas. So if you're applying for, say, a bioenergy grant or a vehicles grant, please go to the website and see what else is being funded. In many cases, a lot of our programs hold conferences and conferences where recent awardees present, and you can see what's come up to speed relatively quickly in the field as to what is the kind of latest and greatest in R&D in this area. That will probably help you get some breadth to your application and really understand what the competition is doing. So I'm just going to go through those 3 areas that I mentioned. In clean energy, these are the 4 different program offices that participate. Electricity delivery, and in this Release 2 FOA that's out right now, all 4 of these program offices are participating. We have the electricity delivery and energy reliability office. And again, they're mostly focused with smart grid. They focus on power electronics and grid reliability. and we have 2 topics in that area in the current solicitation. Our Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, this is one of the biggest programs, R&D programs, that are participating in SBIR. And they cover a wide gamut on the efficiency side, related to making more efficient buildings and vehicles, to the renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal. Fossil energy, again, focused on how do we make the most of our fossil energy resources. There's quite a range of topics here relating from everything from computational and materials issues to things like carbon sequestration and oil and gas technologies. And then finally, our Office of Nuclear Energy. Again, a range of topics associated with everything from materials used in nuclear reactors to sensor systems to monitor reactors and transport of waste. Again, I would encourage you to look through all the different topics. And again, today's webinar is focused on really the funding opportunity announcement and how to apply. We already had webinars which featured each of these program offices and had program managers speak about their topics. Those webinars, I think we did accidentally not record one of them, but those are actually posted on the DOE website, DOE SBIR website. The second area is in science and engineering leadership. Most of these programs participate in Release 1 with the exception of Fusion Energy Sciences, and they are participating in Release 2. And as you would expect, they are interested in a range of issues related to materials, diagnostics, and even simulation related to developing fusion energy. They also do some work on low temperature plasmas as well, and we have a topic for that. And finally, the work on nuclear security. Neither of these programs is participating in Release 2. If you're interested in this, our nuclear nonproliferation typically participates in our first release that's already closed. Next, I'm going to go through the whole application and award process. And again, this is really targeted at folks who've not applied to our program so they understand the timelines and the process for applying. So here's our timeline. And the scale here is in months. Starting with 0 is when your application is due. And I've shown the timeline for Phase 1 and Phase 2. And typically, we issue topics about 3 months before the applications are due. And the reason we do that is, initially you should really be finding a topic area that fits for you. You don't have to worry about how to apply if there's really not a topic area that's, a fit for your area of expertise. About 2 months before the applications are due, we issue the funding opportunity announcement, and that was just issued last week. And then the next key event is the letter of intent due date. If you are interested in applying, we do have a mandatory letter of intent. And so that is an important date to keep in mind. It's December 16th for Release 2. And then finally, the application due date, and that's going to be February 4th. The dates are included in the following slides. Again, we have a review and selection process that takes just under 3 months. Once you're selected and notified that you did receive an award, you'd have approximately 6 weeks to negotiate with our finalize your award with the Chicago office, and then start the research. And typically, again, a Phase 1 proposal can be up to 9 months. At the conclusion of your Phase 1, we would put out the funding opportunity announcement in advance of your the end of your Phase 1 award, and then applications would be about 2 months before the applications are due. And your Phase 1 project would really end only a couple of weeks, I think about 3 weeks before the applications are due for Phase 2. And part of that is really to keep the gap short between when your Phase 1 funding ends and your Phase 2 funding starts. Again, we have a similar review and selection process and negotiation process. And then our Phase 2 budget period is typically about 2 years. In terms of the award amounts, we have 2 award amount sizes, and they vary with topic. For Phase 1, it would be either $150,000 or $225,000. And for Phase 2, it would be $1 million or $1.5 million. We do have two funding opportunity announcements or solicitations every year for Phase 1. And as I mentioned, the different programs would, not all the programs participate in both of them. In fact, they typically participate in only one. And so these are the ones that participated in Release 1, and these are the ones that are currently participating in the Release 2 that was just announced. And as far as key dates, these are the dates associated with our 14 schedule. For Release 2, as I mentioned, the key date here for next step for you is, if you are interested in applying, is to make sure you submit a letter of intent by the 16th, and then your applications will be due February 4th. Here's our Phase 2 schedule, and wanted to point out that really only our Phase 1 awardees are eligible for Phase 2. So they will be sent an email indicating, just reminding them of these due dates. A couple of recent changes that we've made. One is that in case you decide to submit, for example, an STTR for your Phase 1 and have decided you'd like to switch to SBIR for Phase 2, that is now allowed. So you can switch programs at the end of Phase 1, shifting and going into Phase 2. And then also, the thing we want to point out is that your Phase 1 final report must be submitted with your Phase 2 application. Okay, so that was kind of the overview of the process, and I'm going to break it down into the individual steps and talk about each step in a little more detail. So as I mentioned on the process timeline, topics are the first thing that we would issue. And we did receive some questions about sort of the nature of our topics. And DOE typically uses what I would call very focused topics. Some agencies, such as NSF, may have what are termed very broad topics or investigator-initiated type applications. DOE is a mission agency. As I mentioned, some of the areas that we focus. We do fund a lot of work outside of small businesses at universities and national labs. We have a good, our finger on the pulse of what's going on in these R&D areas and where critical breakthroughs are needed. And therefore, the focus of a lot of the SBIR topics are what are seen as the critical mission needs for DOE. So we don't really have, we don't accept unsolicited SBIR proposals. They do have to align with the topic areas. We are a granting agency, so we want to point out that the communication with DOE program managers is allowed. So when you see our topics, we in fact encourage you to talk to the program managers. And in fact, we have a webinar just to have them shortly discuss what types of innovations they're looking for. Again, we've already held that for this particular funding opportunity announcement. The one thing I want to keep in mind is, the focus of your discussion with the DOE program managers is really, is what you're proposing fit within the topic area. They really can't advise you on whether you should submit or not, and those are your own decisions. But they can answer questions related to the work that you're proposing and whether it fits, in their topic area. On the next slide, we have a brief topic. This is actually one from Release 1. Just to show you the key parts of it. So again, we number each topic, and each subtopic has a letter. And the important thing is, when you do apply, you do need to let us know which topic and subtopic you're applying to. And this is a fairly important decision on your part, because if you pick something, even our program managers might look at something and say, "Wow, they really should have applied to a different topic or subtopic," but we will not independently move you around. Because if you've applied there, then that's what you feel is the best place to apply. So again, I would encourage you to talk. If you think you fit in a few places, we would encourage you to talk to a few of the program managers that are involved to find that best fit before you submit your letter of intent. Because again, once you submit that letter of intent, that's what you're telling us is where you're planning to apply. I would point out that we do have a new topic header this year. It does indicate the award amount for Phase 1 and Phase 2. And also indicates whether this topic is accepting SBIR and STTR applications, as well as Fast Track. I'll talk a little bit more about the Fast Track applications a few slides down. The other key information here associated with every topic is the contact information for the what we sometimes refer to as the topic manager. So if you want to know a little more about whether your project fits, and this is maybe get a little more clarification, that's the person you should contact. We'd encourage you to do email. It is hard to get people by phone, so that's why we generally include emails for that. If you find that you need to have a conversation really to move it further, you can request the phone number from the program manager. The other thing I would point out is we do have an other subtopic. This is not really a topic area that you can submit anything that you would like. And this is really intended to broaden the topic slightly. So we normally would have a topic area and then have individual subtopics. And this is really to find other things that fit within the topic, but maybe outside of these specific topic areas. Not all of our topics have this. Some of our topics we feel are fairly broad and do not have this. Some that look for very specific requirements would typically have this other subtopic in it. And finally, our program managers do try to bring you up to speed on recent research in this area or some key recent literature. So do take advantage of looking through the references that they provide, perhaps in advance of contacting them with your questions. A new feature we implemented last year are technology transfer opportunities. Most of our topics are really defining sort of the kind of key innovations that we're looking for, and we're looking for your new ideas on how to overcome those barriers. With tech transfer opportunities, it's a little different. What's happened here is that the programs have funded research at a DOE national lab or a university, and some of that R&D funding has resulted in patents. And what we're looking for you to do is read through those patents and write an application on how you're going to move that invention and to the private sector and commercialize it. So the main difference here is not only do you receive an SBIR and STTR grant, but you'll also receive an option from the lab or university to license the technology. I don't have time here to go into all the details of this, but this is a fundamentally different topic, and we try to label those. In the title of the topic, we will include this term, technology transfer opportunity, so that you're aware. And on the next page, I have again an example. Again, this one's from Release 1, and again, right at the beginning, we will, in the topic area, tell you this is a technology transfer opportunity, and what we will present is what was the invention at the lab, and we'll also provide you with some links to more information at the lab or more information from the U.S. Patent Office so that you can actually refer to the patent itself. A lot of your questions in this case will probably best be answered by contacting the lab or the university. We do provide the DOE program manager if you have any questions about how you intend to use the invention and are concerned about that aspect of it. Again, after as I mentioned before, we issue our topics, the next step is to issue the funding opportunity announcement. And these are really the rules associated with the competition. We include data such as how many awards we anticipate making, the detailed eligibility requirements, what's required in your application. We got questions about what do I need to submit an application. All of that information is contained in the funding opportunity announcement. We also describe how we're going to review your application and details associated with administering your award. And again, this is typically open for about 9 weeks. And again, until you submit your application, you are still permitted to talk with the DOE program managers about the topic areas. Once that's open, and as we mentioned for this funding opportunity announcement, the letter of intent is due only in a couple of weeks on December 16th. And in terms of what you must provide, here's the content. The key, the reason we require letters of intent, in case you're curious, is really so that we can start the process of identifying reviewers. That gives us a head start so that when your application comes in, the reviewer's already been identified and we can start the review process. If we have to wait until we see your application, that just further delays the processing of your application. So when you're submitting your abstract, we're not looking for a simple one-sentence summary of the area you're working in. We're looking for technical information that tells us enough detail so that we can decide, oh, really we should look for reviewers with maybe a more chemical background, optical, mechanical, whatever it is, depending on the nature of the R&D that you're proposing. Please keep in mind that these descriptions should be non-proprietary. We don't accept proprietary information submitted with the letter of intent. The other key thing we're looking for is your list of collaborators. And the reason that's important is, as I mentioned, we're looking to assign reviewers. And if you have a collaborator from a particular university, business, or lab, we won't pick any reviewers from those institutions. The other key thing you need to tell us is whether this is a regular phase 1 or a fast track application. I apologize, I haven't mentioned what a fast track application is yet, but we'll get to that shortly. And one other point is we do limit the number of letters of intent and applications you can submit to a particular funding opportunity announcement, and that limit is 10. In terms of feedback you'll get from letters of intent, again, I mentioned the primary purpose is reviewer assignment. Our program manager will look at those letters of intent, and if they see that you appear to be non-responsive, and we can't really make a determination on how responsive you are until we see your full application. So all we're telling you at this time is if you appear to be non-responsive, we will send you a note that you appear to be so, and we would encourage you to reread the topic, perhaps contact the program manager again to make sure that the application you submit is responsive. If when you submit your application you're deemed non-responsive, we won't review it. And so that will be a wasted effort on your part. So we're trying to avoid that situation. And again, we won't provide you any feedback if you appear to be responsive. So we will only notify those folks that where we feel that there's an issue. In terms of how you submit your letter of intent, you would actually go to the DOE, the Portfolio Analysis and Management System, which is we refer to as PAMS. And here's the link right here. Again, for those of you attending today, you will get a copy of the presentation sent to you. So you can click on this link, go to the website. You do need to create an account, and your letter of intent will be submitted as a PDF file. On our website, we do have more information on instructions for the LOI, and as well as an example of a letter of intent. Okay, so once you're done with the letter of intent, the next stage is submitting your application. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the application process, what things you need to do. And then I'll finally get into details of the different types of application, SBIR versus STTR, and just a regular phase 1 versus a fast track application. We are a granting agency, and therefore our applications are submitted through grants.gov. Unfortunately, to submit an application through grants.gov, you have to do 3 different things. The first is you have to obtain something called a DUNS number. And the instructions for each of these steps is including in the grants.gov applicant user guide. There's a link right here. And so you have to obtain a DUNS number. You have to complete what's called a SAM registration. This is the System for Award Management. So anybody trying to get federal funding, whether through a grant or a contract, has to complete this registration. And then finally, you would be able to complete the grants.gov registration once you do either of these. One of the challenges we often see is that people are more focused on filling out their application and the technical issues, and then sometimes postpone all the details of applying to the last minute. So this is one area, because it requires 3 steps and one must occur after the other, and some of them, such as the SAM registration, may take a week by itself to complete. We would encourage you, if you're thinking about applying, to go ahead and start this process now. If you submit a letter of intent, there's probably still enough time at that point to go through this process. Do not wait until a week before the application is due to try to complete all these steps. You will not be successful. You will not be able to submit your application through grants.gov, and we will not be able to review it. So, in grants.gov, you'll be able to look up our solicitation and download the application package. So this is an example of an application package. It's actually a PDF document that has several documents embedded in it, and the instructions are contained in the document itself. But in addition to that, we do provide other resources. So that's the funding opportunity itself, in addition to the topics document, the funding opportunity, and then finally there's a separate set of instructions that just walks you through filling out this grant application. And again, all of these documents you can find on our website. When you fill out your application, here are the sort of the key elements of your application. As you expect, the actual technical proposal, or what we refer to as your project narrative, is the key document. Please be aware that we do have page and word limits. Although we are interested in getting as much information as we can, in cases in the past, sometimes these have drifted up to 50 to 100 pages, and we do have to review your application in a timely fashion, and our reviewers really don't have the time to go into that much detail. So you should be able to succinctly describe, the innovation that you're proposing. And here are the page limits depending on the type of application you're submitting. We also need your budget and the justification for your budget, description of your key personnel and their backgrounds. And then finally, another key piece is the commercialization plan. As I mentioned before, there's an increasing emphasis on commercialization, and DOE does require both a Phase 1 and a Phase 2 commercialization plan. We do have instructions on filling those out in the funding opportunity announcement. For Phase 1, we do have an example plan that you can click on if you're looking for more guidance. This one can be rather short. It can only be 2 to 3 pages. It doesn't have to be exhaustive. With Phase 1, I know you're primarily focused on the technical innovation. We do want you to start thinking about this. We don't want you to wait until Phase 2 to dig into it in depth. The Phase 2 commercialization plan is much more in depth, and the instructions for that are in the Phase 2 funding opportunity announcement. There's also an SBIR and STTR information sheet. These are mostly clickable boxes that you need to check with certain information that's required for all SBIR and STTR applicants. And here we've put in some of the key application errors. And some of these, which we would call serious or fatal errors, are the ones that prevent you from getting reviewed. In other words, we would end up declining you without review. So as I mentioned before, there are a number of people who just are not able to submit an application to grants.gov by the deadline because they failed to do the registrations. Or even more common is that you actually have to update your SAM registration every year. If you don't update it and then go the day before the deadline and try to submit to grants.gov, and grants.gov indicates your SAM registration is not up to date, you go back to SAM, it may take several days to a week for that change or updated registration to propagate to grants.gov, in which case you won't be able to apply. So even if you're a previous applicant, you need to go into SAM, update your registration. The other challenge we've seen is people forget or fail to submit a Phase 1 commercialization plan. Again, if you leave this out, we can't review your, this is a requirement, we cannot review your proposal. So the tricky part of this is you do submit it in a particular field 12 of research and related. Grants.gov does not check for that document specifically because it's in a field with a lot of other attachments. So if you fail to put it in, you won't get a message back from grants.gov that you left it out. We will only notify you after DOE has pulled the application down from grants.gov and found that out. And then finally, if you don't comply with the word and page limits for the project narrative, that's another reason that we would have to decline your application. So pay particular attention to these 3 issues. The other things that errors, and these are not fatal errors in the sense that they may just, depending on the nature of the problem, they could bounce you out, but it's maybe something else that you just need to change and might delay your award. So I'll talk a little bit more about what's called level of effort. So for SBIR and STTR, the small business has to do a certain percentage of their work. For STTR, the research institution has to do a certain percentage of the work. And you need to calculate that and make sure you comply. If you don't comply, we can't give you an award. The other thing is that we do seek to protect the proprietary data that you submit with your application. But for us to do that, you have to mark it properly. Our funding opportunity announcement has very explicit instructions for how to do that. If you don't comply with that, we will probably get back to you and indicate that what you've submitted is not satisfactory. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears and talk about the application types. So there are two types, SBIR and STTR. Some federal agencies have separate solicitations, an SBIR versus an STTR solicitation. DOE just issues solicitations for which you can apply both to SBIR and STTR. In fact, if you meet the requirements for both SBIR and STTR, you can check a box on the form that indicates you'd like to submit to both programs. And here are the requirements for that. So one, in terms of the level of effort, again, for SBIR, for Phase 1, the small business must perform 67% or two-thirds of the R&D. For Phase 2, you must perform at least half. For STTR, again, this is a collaboration with a research institution. For both Phase 1 and 2, the small business must perform at least 40%, and the research institution must perform at least 30%. So again, these are critical. We cannot fund you if you fall outside of these ranges. The other key difference between the programs is the principal investigator, which I mentioned previously, that for SBIR, they must be principally employed by the small business. And principally means that is their primary employment. You cannot work somewhere else at a university and say, well, I'm part-time employed at this business and therefore I'm a PI. You must be primarily employed by the small business. STTR does have the provision that the principal investigator may come from either the small business or the research institution. And note for STTR, we still only accept the application from the small business. Research institutions are not eligible to apply for these grants. And when you're collaborating, for STTR, we are required by statute to ensure that the small business and the research institution have an agreement in place that covers your intellectual property and commercialization rights. If you don't have that in place, we cannot make you an award. So if you're not familiar with that type of an agreement, we do have a model agreement on our website that you can look at. But if you are planning for STTR, please go ahead and look at this. You don't have to submit this with your application, but before you receive an award, you do have to put this in place. For SBIR, again, there's no restrictions on it. You can also work with a research institution, a university, or a national lab. And in the past, we did have a waiver requirement for this, but that has been eliminated in the recent reauthorization. We got some questions on fast track. I see already coming through, and so I'm finally get around to talking about that. So when you submit, you can just apply for either the Phase 2 or a fast track, and a fast track is simply a combined Phase 1, Phase 2 application. So instead of describing the first 9 months of the project, you're actually going to define the first 9 months and the next 24 months. So your project narrative is going to cover the entire budget period, and your commercialization plan needs to be a Phase 2 commercialization plan, not the simpler Phase 1. In terms of why we have a fast track program, with our current process, you would get a Phase 1 grant that would be 9 months long. At the end, you would apply for Phase 2, but again, going through the award and negotiation process, there would be a gap here of about 5 months before you actually started your Phase 2 project. With the fast track, once you start, you're awarded for your Phase 1. We still have a checkpoint before you finish your Phase 1 to enable you to move on to Phase 2. But again, in this case, there would be no gap. You would be able to work continuously through. The one thing I would point out is that you do have to have a very compelling Phase 1, Phase 2 application. A lot of the work we do, particularly in Phase 1, is high risk. And if you have a high-risk Phase 1 for which the research path in Phase 2 could look very different, it's probably not as suitable for a Phase 2 application. Because, again, you won't really be able to detail all of that if you really don't know the results of Phase 1. So we still expect the majority of the applications to come in under Phase 1 and a smaller percentage really for Phase 2. Again, if you don't really have a lot of commercialization experience right out of the gate here and aren't able to put together a compelling Phase 2 commercialization plan, this is also a reason not to submit a fast track. As I mentioned, the fast track does have checkpoints through it. You will need to submit a continuation application at the end of the 7th month of your Phase 1 and at the end of the 9th month of your Phase 2. And that's a chance for the program managers to review your progress. And again, if you're not making adequate progress, your grant would not continue. And just to be clear, we don't let you submit both a Phase 1 and a fast track separately. You've got to choose what you believe is most suitable for you in terms of the nature of the R&D you're proposing and how well you understand that whole 3-year R&D process. Again, for last year, only about 4% of the applications came in through fast track. It was the first year of the program, and it had similar, not identical, award rates to our Phase 1. And again, not all topics accept fast track, so please look at that topic header I mentioned previously to make sure that that particular topic is accepting fast track applications. Now, once we receive your application, to say a few words about how we review it and how the selection process. Again, we primarily use external peer review, so we will send it outside the agency primarily for review. We use typically 3 technical reviewers, and then for Phase 2, we will also assign 1 reviewer just for the Phase 2 commercialization plan. And the 3 areas that we look at are really the strength of your idea, or what you're proposing technically. Is it innovative? Is it a significant advance in the state of the art? What is the team and the facilities you have in place to carry out the R&D? And finally, what's the impact? What's the impact on your company in terms of the products or services that you can bring to market, as well as the impact beyond that in terms of maybe it's a critical innovation related to our ability to detect beta or neutrons, beta radiation or neutrons, in terms of an NNSA type project, or its ability to improve our prospects for energy efficiency or renewable energy. So those are the 3 areas, and make sure your proposal captures those, because that's what we're looking at in the review criteria. And again, you will be notified on the decision within 90 days, and our reviewer comments will be made available to you. And because the programs are competitive, just want to point out that sometimes it's hard to look at those reviews when you've seen that you were declined, but we would encourage you to stick with it. Not everybody, in fact, most people don't win the first time they apply, and use that feedback to improve your chances in the future. In case you're wondering where our reviewers come from, actually for DOE we have a large fraction of them coming from our national labs, about half, about a third from universities, a few from some other government labs, not DOE labs, and then also from the private sector. And again, when reviewers, in terms of looking at so again, they will keep your application information confidential. They do have to indicate and confirm that they don't have a conflict of interest in reviewing your applications. In fact, our program managers will typically select reviewers, again, based on looking at the nature of the research and the type of collaborators involved in making those assignments. So getting at the issue of what are your chances of winning an award. So again, these are our data for last fiscal year 13. Fiscal year 14 started October 1st. So, and again, for Phase 1, we received over 2,200 applications, made 320 awards. Here's our sort of award rate, 14%. We will let you know, actually, if you were actually recommended for funding and not awarded. So what we're trying to tell you here, so look at your letter carefully. You'll still be, in this case, this is a decline letter. But what we're trying to tell you is that there was nothing fundamentally wrong with your application. It's just that we don't have enough funding to award all the meritorious applications. That's different from the next group, which is those who are not recommended for funding. And here, based on the review process, we did identify issues for which we don't feel it's the right time to move forward with that proposal. And finally, we do have a small percentage, again, declined without review for some of the reasons that I mentioned previously, leaving out a Phase 1 commercialization plan or not being responsive to the topic area. Again, here's similar data for Fast Track. As I mentioned, we received a lot fewer Fast Track awards. The award rate was lower, 11%, but but we, again, had a much smaller statistics here in terms of the numbers. I'm also presenting on the next slide the Phase 2 data. So if you are successful for Phase 1, we wanted to let you know that your chances of moving into Phase 2 once you have a Phase 1 are actually much higher than you saw in Phase 1. So again, we had 223 applications, 108 awards. Again, with a similar scheme that here they awarded about almost half of those who applied for Phase 2. There's another group that were recommended funding, not awarded, because we don't have the enough funding. And again, those who, based on the reviews, were not recommended for funding. One of the other things I wanted to point out is that we often get the question, hey, I never applied before, not familiar with this. I hear that companies that are very familiar are the ones who are very successful. And here we just wanted to show the line in red is the percentage of our Phase 1 awardees who are first-time applicants. In other words, they've never applied to the DOE SBIR program. And we're happy to see actually this number has been growing in recent years. So, for example, last year, 25% of our applicants were first-time applicants. I hope that that number is encouraging to you if you are a first-time applicant. Again, there are some people who are the difference between this line and this line are those people who applied before, but this time this is their first-time awardees. We certainly like to see these numbers higher, but I think these are actually quite good and should indicate to you, as if you're a first-time applicant, that there's no bias certainly against that. We're really looking at the best ideas. I guess once you are selected for award, as I mentioned before, you'll work with our Chicago office to finalize the award. They will review your budgets, discuss issues with you such as overhead rates. And typically, once you're notified, the grant would start about 6 weeks after your notification. In order for our Chicago office to process your grant in a timely fashion, they will ask you questions, a little more information about your budget or budget justification. So please respond to them in a timely fashion so that you do get your money and it's available on the grant start date. As I mentioned, we do grants. Grants are usually not as cumbersome as contracts in terms of implementation. And the money would be available right away for you to draw down. The intent is for you to expend it and then draw down the grant funds as reimbursing you for the expenses that you've made. Again, then you'll see the final terms and conditions associated with your award with regard to your intellectual property rights, and then also the reporting requirements. So please pay attention to those. Those relate to what technical reports you must submit as you go through your Phase 1 and Phase 2 awards. And there are also some financial reporting that's required as well. And finally, the Department of Energy and many other federal programs offer commercialization assistance. We often have many entrepreneurs who come in with a technical background as opposed to commercial background. You really do need that business development background to be successful in bringing that to market. To assist you in that regard, we do offer commercialization assistance during Phase 1 and Phase 2. The primary focus in Phase 1 actually is helping you develop your Phase 2 commercialization plan. And then in Phase 2, we have a whole sort of menu of options depending on what your path to commercialization is. So if you're going a licensing route, if you're trying to identify perhaps a large company as a commercialization partner, if you're looking to perhaps find markets both domestic and overseas, and need primary market research, those are some of the offerings that are available. Keep in mind we are limited to $5,000 for Phase 1 and $5,000 per year in Phase 2. And that that does limit the amount of assistance that we can provide. And we did also want to point out that you can also provide your own vendor, a company-selected commercialization vendor, and you must submit that with your application. So if you don't want to use our vendor, please submit that when you submit your application. You have to include it there. We won't, after the fact, provide you with commercialization assistance with a vendor you select after you receive an award. Okay, I know we've been going for a while here, and Let me try to move it along. I'm not going to go through this section in detail with regard to the sort of fraud, waste, and abuse concerns. Congress did raise some flags about this. This is really a very small fraction of the awardees who might fall into this category. Let's see. Chris, I don't know if on my screen the slides aren't advancing.
Have you lost network connection, Maddie?
I think I did. What slide? Can you move through the slides?
Yeah, we are on the IG slides, and
right.
I can
okay.
move it.
So on slide 47, all I'm going to mention here is that when you do accept money for the government, and again, not trying to scare you off. Again, the vast majority of folks are trying to do the right thing to do what the program is really intended, to come up with innovations and drive them to commercialization. So that's all good, but there are occasionally people who might trip up on the rules, and probably the biggest one is that we have a lot of questions about is, can I submit the same idea to multiple agencies? And the answer to that is yes, but you have to be careful that you only accept one award. One of the biggest mistakes you could make is actually taking multiple awards for doing the same or essentially similar work. So you want to completely avoid that or the appearance of that, and always talk to the agency if you have something where you think there might even be the chance that somebody might construe that you're taking, getting 2 or 3 awards all for the same thing. Be very careful there. But otherwise, again, you must meet the eligibility requirements, be a small for-profit business, do the work in the United States. This is a domestic R&D program. And there's some other issues. I won't go into the details in the slides since we are running a little long, but that is the kind of the brief message for that. I think that ends the presentation. I wasn't going to go into much detail. I think we can just stop now for questions. Oops. Yeah, so I was just going to stop for questions.
Okay, very good. Well, we are having a little bit of some technical difficulties here with our network connection, so bear with us as we read through some of these questions and try to maintain the connection. So let me go ahead and just start with one of the questions that we've received here, Maddie. Does submitting a proposal under an other subcategory put you at a disadvantage?
Again, the other subcategory is really looking at, again, that's our ability to take some new ideas, not in the specific topic areas that we had targeted. And in the past, our award rates for that category have not been that different from the specific subtopics. So you shouldn't look at it as necessarily as a kind of a subtopic where the probability of success is inherently low. That's really not the case. It does vary quite a bit by the program as to how much they utilize the other subtopic. So what we would do is encourage you really to talk to the program manager if you are submitting under other, to make sure what you're submitting is still responsive to the topic. However, that's probably the most important advice I think we can give you.
Okay. Are patent fees allowable under the grant, including international patent fees?
For Phase 1, we do not allow that as part of your budgeted amount. In Phase 2, you can look through the Phase 2 funding opportunity announcement, and we do allow for patent fees to be included in Phase 2.
How about equipment? Is equipment purchased, for example, hydro turbines, an acceptable grant request?
Again, the equipment is typically, maybe for most of the grants that we see, mostly characterization or equipment associated, can be processing-related equipment, but it should not be a large fraction of your grant. A grant, the equipment is really there to help you perform R&D. We are not really, using these grants to, help you acquire equipment. So keep that in mind. I mean, typically equipment might be less than 10% of the R&D budget. There may be exceptional cases where you have a very unique requirement, And again, even there, again, I encourage you to talk to the program manager to get their opinion if they think that's excessive.
Okay, and here are two related questions. I'm proposing a renewable energy source that is not covered in the topics. Is there a general topic under which it could be submitted? And do you accept unsolicited applications for these grants?
Yeah, so the answer there, as I indicated in our presentation, is that DOE is, unlike some agencies which have investigator-initiated grants, does not do that. We have basically feel that in the areas that are in our mission areas that we understand what the critical problems are, and therefore we're really looking for companies to help us address that. So in some ways, the benefit is you don't have to justify why you are submitting this, because in fact we're asking and telling you this is a technical problem area. But at the same time, that does preclude us from accepting these unsolicited applications. Now, DOE does have a place to submit unsolicited grant proposals. They are not SBIR applications, but a general unsolicited proposal submission. And if you just Google DOE unsolicited proposal, I think the first link up would bring you to that.
We have a core technology that could be of interest to multiple SBIR topics. As long as each SBIR letter of intent has unique goals, expected outcomes, and different research tasks, is it all right to have some redundancies in the letters of intent where we are describing the fundamentals of our technology?
Yeah, that does. There is some overlap in some of our program areas where you might be able to submit to more than one topic, kind of on a related technology area. So that is permissible. However, what I would encourage you to do is to contact the program managers so that you can clarify exactly what they're looking for the topic to make sure what you're submitting is relevant and responsive. We don't really want you fishing around and trying to dump in a lot of letters of intent across all different program areas, because again, based on those letter of intents, we will start identifying reviewers. So it's kind of a disservice to us and the reviewers if you're just kind of putting placeholders in and may only submit to some fraction of your letters of intent. So we would appreciate that if you would try to narrow that down before you submit your letters of intent.
And there seems to be some a misunderstanding in regards to majority VC-funded companies participating at DOE. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is a little more detailed area, so I'll try to cover it as best I can. With the new reauthorization, what they allowed was if your ownership is multiple, if you're owned by multiple venture capital, hedge fund, private equity firms, a majority owned by multiple. And so the key there is majority owned and multiple. So if you are owned by, for example, one venture capital firm that has greater than 50% ownership, you are not eligible anywhere throughout the federal SBIR and STTR programs. You have to have multiple companies. Now, as I mentioned, for the DOE SBIR programs, which we're presenting today, we have not opted into that option. So let's say you're 20% owned by 3 different venture capital firms. You are still not eligible to participate in the DOE programs. You are eligible to participate in NIH and the ARPA-E programs, which have opted to use that authority.
In regards to commercialization, what percentage of SBIR programs that got patents ended up commercializing, and what fraction received investor funding? Are you aware of any of this? So there are separate questions there. I think you did ask for a company that got it. I don't have the data on top of my head in terms of companies that got patents, then commercialized, and then received follow-on funding. I think among all of our, and again, this is Phase 2 awardees, among our Phase 2 awardees, approximately 40% of the Phase 2 awardees do commercialize. And again, that's over a wide range, a revenue range, from the sort of one-off, delivering one device up through people who have been very successful. I think our most successful company, achieved over $500 million in revenue. So it's, kind of the long tail type distribution where, only a few percent of the 40%, I'd say really only 2 to 3% were
extremely successful in terms of even becoming, say, large firms or having a significant amount of revenue.
Okay, this is in regards to the funding limits for a Phase 1 award. Can you talk about the difference between $150,000 and $225,000, or how does a program determine those amounts per topic?
Yeah, so in terms of your application, just so there's no confusion, every topic has a header in it, and every topic header will tell you this is the maximum award amount for Phase 1 and the maximum award amount for Phase 2. Please keep that in mind. So if you have a topic in mind, and that amount will vary by topic. And so our program managers, in deciding how much funding they want to apply, will look at the nature of the R&D that they're requesting for you. Some types of work are inherently more capital intensive or may require more expensive materials, and therefore program managers may have elected to have those topics receive higher funding amounts. So just keep in mind that please always refer to the topic header, and the topic header will give you the maximum. So do not go over the maximum amount.
And I've heard that I can request a copy of a winning award. If this is true, where do I send my request for a small wind turbine R&D winning an award?
You can, anytime you request information from the government, you can request funding through FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and there is a DOE FOIA office, and I'm not going to know the website offhand, but I think, again, if you Google DOE FOIA, it will bring you to that website.
In regards to the level of effort, for an STTR, can the level of effort be at the research institution? So I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there, but for STTR we have separate level of effort requirements both for the small business and the research institution. The small business must do 40%, at least 40% of the work, and the research institution must do at least 30%. So there are two essentially level of effort requirements that apply to STTR. You talked briefly about the PI. Can you give us kind of a little bit more of a definition of what a PI is?
Sorry, I didn't actually say what it is. It is a principal investigator. So DOE does define the, sorry for the use of acronyms here, getting too carried away. The principal investigator is the lead on the project and will be directing the research. So we are looking for that generally to be somebody who's qualified, has some experience in leading R&D projects. And that is one of the critical people on the proposal. I would also point out we don't accept co-PIs. So if you want to put 2 or 3 people in that role, we don't accept that. You do have to designate just one person as the principal investigator.
So related to the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, are SBIR, STTR proposals subject to disclosure under FOIA?
So the answer to that gets a little more complicated. Certainly, as we've indicated, anything you mark proprietary would never be disclosed under FOIA. And generally, the answer to that also depends on whether you've won an award or not won an award. If you win an award, we do disclose publicly the name of the company and the topic area that you work in and a brief summary associated with the award. We do have an obligation to let the public know how we are spending their money. With regard, but if you do not receive an award, again, we generally do not acknowledge or respond to FOIA requests for award, applications that are not awarded. But again, there are very complex FOIA regulations, so I can't give you just a simple answer for that. As I said, it depends if you win or lose. But in any case, anything you mark proprietary would not be released. So that's why we put so much emphasis on that.
Okay, and I would like to just note, too, that you will be receiving a copy of both this recorded webinar, a link to the recorded webinar, and a copy of the PowerPoint slides. And I'll point out many of the links that you're seeing in this webinar are not active in the actual webinar itself, but they will be active in the PowerPoint presentation. here's a question in regards to the topics and submitting. If a program area does not have an other category, will proposals that do not specifically address a listed topic be considered? Can those be submitted?
Again, this gets really related to the question we had earlier about unsolicited proposals. So we don't accept unsolicited proposals through the SBR and STTR programs. Again, I would encourage you, if you have some novel idea that doesn't really fit in some place, to contact the, again, Google DOE unsolicited proposals. There is a place within the department to submit those.
And is there a sample LOI, letter of intent, available for us to see?
Yes, there is a sample letter of intent on the website. But as I mentioned, it's fairly straightforward. It was just the information that I had presented on that slide. The key issues really are a technical abstract that's detailed enough so that we can assign reviewers and a list of your collaborators. That's the key pieces of information. We also just need to know you identify your small business and related information about the business.
Is there an arbitration process for Phase 2 funding rejections if the initial reviewers appear to have misunderstood a portion of the Phase 2 submission?
No, there really isn't an arbitration or protest process for grants. We certainly would like your feedback. So if there is something you felt that was unwarranted, one of the things to keep in mind, the reason we have multiple reviewers, both on Phase 1 or Phase 2, is to try to get some balance. That program managers do look for perhaps one of the reviewers didn't really understand something, and their review was based on some misperception of what you're proposing. So they do look at the reason we have multiple reviews is to try to achieve that balance. You should not assume that every comment is factored in determining whether you get recommended for funding. The program manager makes a recommendation on reading the reviews. There's no automatic process based on reviewer scores to determine whether you receive funding or not.
Okay, and I'd like to point out that all of our previous webinars that we've had on the topics are available on our website. Right here, you go to this website and then go to the funding opportunities, and you will see a list of topic webinars. If you are interested in seeing those, you will find them there. And also, there will be a link to this webinar shortly following today's meeting under the appropriate box there on this page. So how do we get previous research information from the organization that initiated the topic research? I guess that would be in order of trying to understand the topic.
Yeah, sort of. Again, many of our topics do have references. So that's the first place I would start, is really looking at if the topic provided references. If not, then I would go to the program website. So for example, if the topic was under fossil energy, I would go to the fossil energy program website. When I covered all the programs earlier, I did provide links to all the program offices, so you can just click on those. Or you can just Google, for example, the program office and pull that up. And so again, the amount of information available will vary by program. Some post more of the information in terms of their strategies and past research they funded and any roadmaps or other information they might have. Others may not have more available. Our applied programs, which are participating in Release 2, typically have more of that, whereas our basic science programs have typically less related to the SBR topics. A lot of the information they provide are related to their basic research areas and their mission.
Okay, and two questions that are closely related. Is the chance of winning a grant better with an STTR than with an SBIR? And does a TTO proposal have a better chance of being funded?
So with SBR and STTR, typically the award rates are very similar. In any given year, one might be maybe a few percentage points higher than the other, but they can flop back and forth. So there's nothing we can tell you in advance that would tell you that your award rate will be higher under one program or the other. They're generally very close. And in fact, we have a lot of people who submit to STTR, submit to both, which allows us to look at the funding situation and make awards accordingly. With regard to the TTO, we can't really comment on the likelihood of the award. A lot of these really depend on the quality of the applications. If we don't get high-quality applications, there may be no awards under that. If we have several high-quality applications, again, under TTO, we typically would only award one. The award rates last year, I think, were a little lower for TTO, but I think that was really the first year of the implementation. I think there was still some confusion among applicants as to what we were looking for. So we did tighten up some of our topic descriptions this year to make sure that that people understood what they were applying for with the a TTO type topic.
And can after I submit a letter of intent, can I then still speak with the topic manager?
Yes. You haven't submitted an application, so you can still. You shouldn't be discussing your application basically with the program manager, but you should. I mean, once you've submitted one, but until the time you submit an application, you can talk to them.
And what does it mean to appear non-responsive? How can you tell this from a letter of intent?
We use that term. So in our topics, we're going to say we're looking for a breakthrough in a particular area. So this might be how we contain nuclear waste and transport it. And oftentimes people may read, that description and come up with some different angle than what we were proposing. They might say, well, I'm going to put sensors in this container and monitor it. But maybe for this particular topic, we really weren't interested in the sensors. We were interested in a better material to contain it that would be durable or longer life. And so we would look at your description to make sure that, no, this is not really what we had intended under this subtopic. Although we try to be as detailed as we can, inevitably happens that people, interpret the topic differently. So, and again, it's not definitive. You're not giving us, a full, 10, 15-page application, just an abstract. So we don't make a definitive determination. We just let you know if it appears to be non-responsive. You can still submit an application if you get that letter. But again, we encourage you to review the topic and perhaps talk to the program manager.
And can the small business send in 2 letters of intent for the same topic, one under Phase 1 and one under Fast Track?
And the answer to that is no. So if you cannot apply for both Phase 1 and Fast Track, essentially with the same application. You need to pick one or the other.
How many grants do you provide per topic?
That one's a little tricky to answer because we have some topics that have several subtopics, some that may only have one, some that are for programs that are really looking for a lot of ideas on how to solve a very pressing problem. So they might fund a lot of awards under one topic. I can't give you an average number might be on the order of 2 to 3, but it could be as high as again for things with multiple subtopics as many as 5 to 7, or we could have none if we don't receive any high quality applications. Okay,
and what is going to happen if we submit a letter of intent but later decide not to apply?
There really is no penalty for doing that. Like I said, I think just in terms of as a being a responsible applicant, we'd appreciate you not doing that to the extent you know about that. We don't penalize you. We don't hold it against you in the future or anything like that. We understand as you dig into it or time crunches at small businesses, you don't end up having time to submit the application. So there is really no penalty for doing something like that.
And can we get a complete scoring rubric for the funding opportunity announcement showing the scoring for each section?
No, we do not, again, do scoring in that fashion. Again, the reviews are done by, as I mentioned before, 3 technical reviewers. If there's a Phase 2, will also be a commercialization reviewer. And the program manager is making a recommendation funding, based on those reviews. So it's not a score type system. I know with some agencies they will provide you a score, although sometimes that doesn't tell you whether you're going to get funding or not. So we basically make a funding recommendation, and then again we are limited by the funds available, so we will indicate whether you were recommended for, as I mentioned before, whether you're recommended for funding, but we don't have enough funding to fund all of those awards versus and you'll be in one of two categories, either awarded or recommended for funding not awarded.
And you were talking about the SBA company registry and or registrations in general. Does that include the SBA company registry to be completed?
Yes, that is a new requirement, and I apologize for not including that. That is described in the funding opportunity announcement. So companies starting with reauthorization do need to do that registration as well. This is a fairly simple, quick turnaround type registration. So you do need to be registered there. That's not a fatal error. If that's something we decide later that you had not submitted, we can go back to you and get that from you in terms of submitting an application.
Is the budget information or the bio information or commercialization plan part of the page and word count limits?
No, the word count limits only apply to what we refer to as your project or technical narrative, basically the proposal itself. All of the other documents, budgets, budget justifications, key personnel, commercialization plans are not limited by that restriction.
Is there a benefit to apply for both SBIR and STTR if you are eligible for both?
And again, the primary benefit there is related to the funding available in those programs. If we happen to get fewer STTR applications that year, your chances may be slightly higher, vice versa for SBIR, and this just gives program managers the flexibility of going to one or the other.
You guys be wrapping up in the next few minutes.
Yes. Okay, so another question here. Chris had to step out. So what constitutes early stage R&D versus R&D done but no proven technology solution? Again, early stage, we're looking really at the, what again is called seed stage funding. So as I mentioned before, we're looking to go really from idea through prototype. And again, I'm not sure what you mean by proven, because again, even going through that cycle, again, you may address some key issues in terms of the feasibility or viability of a new technology, but typically even then you won't get all the requirements captured at that stage.
Okay, Manny, it looks like we're going to have to wrap up here. We have maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll have to close out. Regarding the level of effort, is it percentage measured in dollar, time, or some other factor?
Yeah, the level of effort is based on your budget. So actually, once you have your budget, you can actually plug the numbers from the different line items in your budget in, and it will determine, and again, we have a spreadsheet on our website that would help you. All you do is move the line items from your budget into the spreadsheet, and it will calculate the level of effort for you. So we would encourage you to use that spreadsheet.
Okay, and one last question. If you apply for the fast track and it is determined to be too risky, can a Phase 1 be awarded instead?
And the answer to that is no. Again, the reviews that we do are based on your full Phase 2, so we cannot, we don't do a separate review of the Phase 1. We look really at the combined application, so we don't actually make a down select to a Phase 1 off of a fast track. So I think we're going to have to wrap up and end with that. There was one other question here I was going to ask. Can a national lab submit it through grants.gov on behalf of a small business? And the answer to that is no. We only take applications from small businesses. So if you do have any other questions, please, I think on our website here, on the page right now that we have our email. If you want to submit any remaining questions to the email address shown there, we will get back to you with answers to that. So sorry to cut off. I know we've been going for quite some time. And
yes, and we're going to keep to our time limit of 3:30 here. Let me point out to you that, once again, you will receive the PowerPoint slides and the recorded webinar soon after today's presentation, but you'll also be receiving an opportunity to comment on today's presentation. So you can let us know what worked and what didn't work and what you may have wanted to see in the future or what you would like to have seen today. Again, well, thank you very much for attending, and this concludes our webinar.
Thank you.
don't we go ahead and kick off? I believe we got Manny on the line here. Manny?
Okay, thanks, Chris. And as Chris mentioned, the presentation is kind of in three parts. Some of you have attended our webinars in the past, so it'll follow roughly the same format. We'll talk briefly about the federal programs, the programs as a whole, primarily for first-time applicants who may not be aware of other programs outside the DOE SBIR. And then we'll talk about the DOE, SBIR, and STTR programs. And then finally, those of you, especially new, interested in how do I apply, and the information you need associated with that. So let's start with the federal programs. And in terms of the purpose of SBIR and STTR, the programs were created in the 80s and 90s. Again, they're two separate programs. I'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two in the next slide. But the motivation was to set aside federal R&D funding for small businesses, because small businesses often were at a disadvantage to compete for R&D funds compared to universities and large companies. And so, again, in the early 80s, the SBIR program was set up. And again, those were the goals when it was originally set up, shown at the top of the screen. And again, one of the things we want to point out, we do encourage participation by minority-owned and women-owned small businesses. There are no specific set-asides for any groups. It's a merit-based competition, but we do encourage participation by those groups. And the last goal there, in terms of the focus on private sector commercialization of federal R&D, that's actually gotten an increased emphasis, especially in the last few years. The area of technology transfer of innovations where the Department of Energy is funding work at universities and national labs. We would like to see those move out, what all these agencies are. And the way the programs are funded, I want to point out, is that they do not receive appropriations from Congress. Congress doesn't give each agency a set of money to implement this. Instead, what happens is they take a percentage of each agency's extramural R&D budget. Extramural refers to R&D money that the agency sends outside the agency for research, as opposed to the intramural research, which is R&D performed at the agency. And again, for 2014, that's 2.8% of our extramural budgets. The STTR program, again, which is different, has more focus on tech transfer, and therefore requires collaboration with a nonprofit research institution like a university or a national lab. Again, this program is smaller. It's only 0.4% of agency extramural budgets this year, and there are only 5 agencies that participate in the STTR program. DOE, being a larger R&D program office, does participate in both programs. So when you look at the combined funding across the federal government, there's quite a bit of money going out through the SBIR and STTR program, so $2.4 billion in total. And you can see that it's not spread very equally. Certainly the largest source of R&D in the government is the Department of Defense, and then the second is the National Institutes of Health. DOE is kind of in that next tier with NASA and the National Science Foundation. And again, there are another 6 agencies that participate, and we would encourage you to look at those if the focus area of these agencies overlap with the technology areas that you're interested in. So, for example, folks who work with the Department of Energy who might work on bioenergy might be interested in looking at the Department of Agriculture. Some of the work, if you're working on...
Welcome all to the Department of Energy's SBIR, STTR Programs Office webinar. My name is Chris Ogwin, and I am with the DOE SBIR Programs Office, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Today's presenter is the DOE SBIR STTR Programs Director, Dr. Manny Oliver. Manny will provide you with an overview of the federal SBIR STTR programs, the DOE SBIR STTR technology areas, and the DOE application and award process as it relates to this fiscal year 2014 Phase 1 Release 2 funding opportunity announcement. We will be taking texted questions, so feel free to send in your chat questions there at the lower left-hand side of your screen throughout the webinar, and at the conclusion of this, Manny will address these as time permits. And many of the questions that were submitted as part of registration have been worked into this webinar. So hopefully we'll be able to answer most, if not, well, most of your questions. I'd like to remind folks as you're sending in your text questions, please keep them focused on the funding opportunity announcement and not necessarily on the technology area or your innovation as it relates to the topics. Those questions should be directed to the topic managers as listed in the topics document, in which you can find on our website. You'll see that website throughout the presentation at the bottom of the slide, many of the slides, and it will also be at the conclusion of our website listed there too. Or you can just Google DOE SBIR and you'll find our website fairly quickly. And I think that covers some of the intro stuff.
Environmental issues. We did receive a question asking about how much work DOE does in the area of pollution abatement, and that is not a focus area. So we do treat greenhouse gases as a harmful to the environment, and so there is research in that area in terms of carbon capture and sequestration, and all the work in renewable energy and energy efficiency, trying to reduce CO2 emissions. But so again, we would encourage you to look at some of the other agencies in addition to DOE if you're new to the SBIR programs. In terms of eligibility and the way we implement the programs, these are small business programs. You do have to be a for-profit business. I guess we did receive a question in advance about being a nonprofit. So we will only accept applications for a for-profit small business. I've summarized the eligibility requirements here. They get a little more detailed. We get a lot of questions about ownership structure and that. So that we would actually refer you to the funding opportunity announcement. If you're still, after reading that, still have questions, please contact us and we'll help you work through that. Some ownership of some companies does get fairly involved. So I did want to point out, and again, you do have to be small, and small is defined as 500 or fewer employees. In terms of your principal investigator for your application, for SBIR, that person does have to be primarily employed by the small business. And for STTR, one of the other key differences with STTR, in addition to collaborating with a research institution, is it does allow the PI to come from the research institution as opposed to the small business. One of the other things I want to point out is one of the recent changes in the legislation is it allows agencies to opt in to allowing companies that are majority owned by venture capital, hedge fund, or private equity firms to participate. At least those that have resulted in patents or other intellectual property to move out for private sector commercialization. Again, over time, the programs have evolved since their original charter, and we just want to emphasize that the emphasis on the commercialization has increased. Again, the programs are R&D programs, so we really only fund early stage R&D, so I want to point that out, but we do want applicants, in terms of submitting their proposals, to let us know what the commercial potential of their inventions are. With regard to where this sits kind of in the whole funding chain, the type of funding, the amounts we have, and the type of work we fund really sort of competes with angel investing in the private sector. It's the early stage seed capital. Some venture firms also do seed stage funding. But the biggest difference between government funding in this area and I think private sector is that we have specific agency missions, and we are willing to take greater risk to succeed in those missions. And those missions, again, will vary by agency. In terms of the nature of the federal program, the oversight for the program is by the Small Business Administration. And although the Small Business Administration provides oversight in terms of policy directives and annual reports, it does not actually is not the organization that you would apply to seek funding. There are 11 federal agencies that run the SBIR and STTR programs, and here I'll mention the SBIR, again, was the earlier program, and there are 11 agencies that are listed there. For those of you new to the government, I apologize for the acronyms. I do have the acronyms listed on the next page in case you're